In addition to these factors, further historical events that will shape Christian approaches to healthcare include the very bodily and public persecution of a select few. Of course, most people know that there is a history of martyrdom in the early Christian centuries. But it's important to point out that the martyrdoms were, or the martyr events, were neither as widespread nor as numerous as many of the sources suggest. However, the martyr events that did occur were public, they were brutal, they were isolated, and they were fairly violent. And the fact that more people, as Paula Fredrickson says, the fact that more people saw the martyr events than experienced them contributed greatly to the promotion of Christianity as a religion or as a philosophy worth defending. So very early, the role of the suffering body will play a part in the development of Christian theology. This will be accompanied by and eventually surpassed by the development of Christian asceticism. Now, there's a fancy academic word there, asceticism, and it comes from ascesis, meaning discipline, and we will speak more about asceticism in another day or so. So you don't have to stress too much about what that word means, but in short, the development of Christian discipline and bodily discipline was particularly important in these early centuries, because how do you prepare for a death like this, right? And of course we know it didn't happen exactly like this, but because for one thing, because lions don't actually operate like that, but this one's a little more realistic. But how do you prepare for not just a death like that, but how do you prepare for the idea of a death like that? And so discipline is required not just to face an untimely or brutal death, but to face the possibility of it. So we'll talk more about asceticism here in another day or so, but just keep that word on the back burner as one you'll need to be mindful of. And then finally, to move closer to our theme of philanthropy, another historical event that will shape Christian approaches to healthcare is the development of Christology, or in time, the solution to the Christological controversy, or in other words, how does one speak about the person of Christ? What words? Here we have the word logos, ology, Christology. So Christology. So how does one use words and language to describe who the person of Jesus is for Christianity? So let's talk just a moment about Christology. There are essentially two main trends that emerged in the language and the speaking about the person of Jesus. It is simplistic to reduce it to this, but for the sake of our general introduction to this topic, I will have to make that egregious error. So one of the main arguments about the person of Jesus is that Jesus was not co-eternal with God, or that Jesus did not always exist alongside the person of God. And of course, on the other side of that argument is the belief that Jesus was, or is, in fact, co-eternal. Jesus was there at the beginning, before the beginning, and always present with God. One side of the argument stated that Jesus was in fact separate in nature from God, but not really very far. So Yusta Gonzalez, a church historian, creates this sort of visual in his really nice volume 1 of the 2-volume Story of Christianity. And he says if you could draw a line between the figure of God and Jesus, but yet Jesus is far beyond creation or above creation, that this is a nice way to visualize this particular argument, which would be the Arian argument as promoted by Arius. So this view of the person of Jesus understands Jesus as the first of God's created beings. All right, so separate from God in that Jesus has been created by God, but yet still separated from all of the created order in that Jesus is the first of God's created beings. So the other side of the argument claims that Jesus and God are one nature, and that if you find that or see that separation between the divine and the created world, you'll notice that Jesus here is on the other side of that barrier, okay? Now, there always has to be a winner and a loser, doesn't there? In time, this position here is going to be the position that is going to largely win out. And I hate to use that language, but very often this is how it is viewed. So the Alexandrian position that holds that Jesus is co-eternal with God and that God and Jesus are one nature apart from the created order, that's going to be the view that is largely going to be supported by what we would call Catholic, Orthodox, and in time Protestant Christians. This view over here that holds that Jesus is not co-eternal and is in fact separate in nature from God will be the theological view that will not go on to be the predominant Christological claim. So what does this mean for Christians, and what does this mean for Christian philanthropy, and how then does that impact Christian views of the body? Well, if you understand that Jesus is co-eternal with God and that Jesus and God are one nature, this is going to impact how you're going to read certain Jewish scriptures like this. In Genesis 1:26-7, then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God, God created them, male and female, God created them. So here you have humanity created in the image of God, which includes, according to Alexandrian theology, includes Jesus. Both in this category here as being the same nature of God, but also in this category here of humankind, which means that humans share in the nature of Jesus because Jesus was human. But then if Jesus is God and also in the nature of God, then humans share in the nature of the divine. In Christian scriptures, one finds this idea reinforced in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 14, "And the Word, the Logos, became flesh and lived among us," a passage that is very often used and promoted as a way of affirming the idea that Jesus is co-eternal with God and one nature with God. Now, this is going to be an important theological claim for a group of individuals known as the Cappadocian Fathers. Fancy word here in reference to this area here, Cappadocia, which is located in modern-day Turkey. So here we have Istanbul over here, modern-day Istanbul. Here we have Greece, and then Syria, and then Jerusalem and Israel is north of that. So Gregor of Nyssa, who wrote the sermon we're going to be reading for this lesson titled "On the Love of the Poor," Gregory was the bishop of this area, of a little town here known as Nyssa, from 372 of the Common Era until his death. As I stated earlier, he was regarded as one of the Cappadocian Fathers. And we can see them here, pictured in this icon to the right of the map. We can see here's Gregory's brother Basil the Great, and here's John Chrysostom, and here is Gregory of Nazianzus, their friend. And these were individuals who believed that Christianity could contribute to Greek and Roman intellectual culture. These were individuals who largely came from a privileged background. They were highly educated in Christian theology in time, but also in the classical liberal arts curriculum, and also in medicine. And all of these leading intellectual giants of early Christianity are going to argue that Christian faith that predominantly functioned for the healing of the soul. And this all sounds very esoteric, but they also contributed in extremely practical ways to care for people. Some examples of that include Basil's Basiliad, which was a massive structure that assisted in the care of those who were struck with leprosy, and it also provided workspace for people. And this is just a drawing, a reconstruction of the structure. It doesn't exist to this day. So before we turn to our reading by Gregory of Nyssa, it's important to point out that for the Cappadocian Fathers, philanthropy, or the love of a human, another human, irrespective of who that human might be, has some particular consequences when that virtue is applied to Christian theology, a theology that argues that the divine is accessible to the human. So Gary Ferngren, who has written our secondary sources for this class, is going to argue that for early Christians, charity is particularly important for Christians because the classical world did not have a religious impulse for individual charity. It doesn't mean that charity didn't exist. And in fact, personal concern for the poor and the needy was an important theme in the Hebrew scriptures, But personal concern or ethical impulses for individual charity on a personal level, person to person, were not part of the classical world. A second consequence is that the doctrine of the human as the image of God provided a basis for the belief that every human life had intrinsic value because every human life carried in it God's image. So this is going to be particularly important for the Cappadocians, among whom Gregory of Nyssa will number. Another consequence of the doctrine of the image of God for philanthropy is that this is going to provide Christians with a new perception of the body, a positive perception of the body, and in fact, a positive view of the person. And we'll talk more about this when we talk about asceticism. And then finally, another consequence will be that this is going to lead to a redefinition of the poor. So the human body in all of its parts is going to share in the divine image. And this is true not only of all Christians, but of all people. So as you read the sermon on Gregory's love of the poor, I'm going to ask you to contextualize what is Gregory's assumption about the proper way to avoid damnation, and how does that relate to disease or the diseased. I'm going to ask you to analyze some of the implications of illness and evaluate how community or society changes with the diseased person in it. As always, feel free to email me